Good morning and welcome to the morning after analysing the results of the French elections. My name's Susi Dennison, for those of you I don't know, and I lead the European Power Programme here at ECFR. So, as you'll all be aware, because you've turned up with your coffee this morning, France held the second round of its legislative elections yesterday, and it was a bit of a surprise. I think the results have not given us the conversation that we were anticipating having this morning, but it's nevertheless given us a lot to talk about. So we saw in a surprise surge yesterday that the new left coalition, the Nouvelle Front Populaire, has come in with the largest number of seats, with 182 seats, and perhaps even more surprisingly, Macron's coalition, built around his party Ensemble, has come in second place, not that far behind, with 168 seats. The Rassemblement National, highly anticipated to come in first place, actually came in third, but still with a big increase in the number of seats to 143. And this was perhaps overall a big victory for tactical voting in France, because we saw such a change from the first round results to those of the second round. So, as I said, although this isn't the conversation we were anticipating having this morning, it's a very tricky one. And in terms of how a government can be built from here, it's going to be quite complex. And perhaps the Rubik's Cube that the current Hungarian presidency of the EU is using as its symbol is going to be a useful tool now for those in Paris trying to form the government going forward. But we've got three great analysts to help us unpack this and draw some conclusions straight away this morning. And so I feel fully confident that we're going to come up with some answers for you, and there'll be an opportunity for you to pose your own questions towards the end of the session. So I'm here this morning with Célia Belin, the head of our the head of our Paris office. Sorry, much more appropriate than Berlin this morning, at ECFR. We're here also with Camille, the deputy head of our Paris office, and Ulrike, Franke, who is a senior fellow based in Paris, German, but with lots of French connections, and an avid France watcher. So if I can, I'm going to go first to you, Célia, for you to give us your sense of what has happened here, and what are the points for us to watch over the coming days and weeks in terms of the government that we might see emerge.
Thank you, Susi. Thank you for hosting us this morning. And indeed, this was a surprise, to say the least. Quite a few pollsters had already envisaged that the National Assembly would not get an absolute majority. That was the discussion over the past few weeks, but a lot more people were expecting, or we were expecting, a lot bigger number of member of parliaments being elected from the National Rally at the end of this second round. National Rally still has an incredibly high score. It ranks in more than 50 seats, going from 89 to 143 and maybe a bit more. So, in any other circumstance, you would have expected the National Rally to really celebrate this as a great win, knowing that, only 7 years ago, National Rally had 3 and then 9 member of parliament. So this is an incredibly high number. But Jordan Bardella, the leader of the National Front, was expected almost to be sitting in Matignon, and he had made his demand that he wanted an absolute majority to govern. We are very, very far from this. And as you said, the big lesson here is the win of tactical voting, or what we call the Front Républicain. The fact of having voters vote in droves for a camp that they might not like, leftist voters voting for the centrist Macron camp, and vice versa, in order to prevent National Rally from grabbing more seats. In many ways, what it demonstrates is that the French refused the sort of pre-written, predestined win of the National Rally, what you've seen in the past week, in particular between first round and second round, with the possibility of a national rally being so close to power, is a massive, media campaign, very spontaneous and on social networks as well, exposing the radicality of the national rally. I think France has been, for the past few years, really divided in its media ecosystem and not necessarily paying attention to what the national rally was actually proposing. And so a number of debates exposed the fact that the national rally had as a core of it a principal national preference, that this national preference would have many consequences on the European stage. It was supporting discriminations against binationals. There was a whole lot of elements that shocked the public and explain this mobilization and tactical voting. Two more points. One is the fact that it's very much as well sort of a surprise victory for the left. The left united was able to grab, in their case, another 50 seats more than in 2022, and in particular to end up as a coalition to be in front of both the Macron camp and the national rally. We have to be clear that this coalition just came about only 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. So this is both brand new and extremely divided. So there's a lot to remain to be discussed, because it's not as if any name for prime minister would come out of this coalition in an instant. And my last point is that for that particular reason, there's high uncertainty on who will govern France. Now that we know it's not the national rally which will govern France, Macron and his and people in his group, as well as the leftist coalition, will have to go in extended conversation in order to try and see where governing majority could come from. And this will be by no means easy, and as already discussed this morning on the radio, could take not only several days, but possibly several weeks. You're muted, Susi.
Can you hear me now? Great. Sorry, apologies, everybody. Thank you very much, Célia, for those reflections. So I'm going to come to you, Camille, now, and I'm sure we'll want to dig into what Célia said in terms of the who we might see in government, speculative as it may be this morning, later on in the conversation. But I wondered if you could try to tell us as much as we can. Célia has talked about what France voted against yesterday, which was a government dominated by the Rassemblement National. But I wondered if you could draw anything from the results in terms of what they voted for in policy terms, what we may see the sort of the basis of a new coalition, assuming it is a coalition rather than a minority government, that would sort of bind the next period together, or whether you feel that the landscape is too mixed even to draw those conclusions at this point.
Thanks, Susi. And yes, this is the big question, because we know what French people voted against, but we are not it's much less clear what they really voted for, actually. A first point, I would say, in terms of what they voted against, what that means exactly. I feel that, and I would be a bit more pessimistic maybe than Célia on this, yes, there is a success of this tactical voting and this kind of a Republican front against the RN, but there is a growing resentment among the French population of being forced again and again to come and gather against the RN. And this is a tactic that Macron has been using for some time, trying to gather people around him, not for a specific program and for specific ideas, but more to vote and make a barrage against the RN. And on that front, for the kind of long-term picture, I think this is a little bit concerning, because the RN is presenting this vote as a kind of denying of a democracy, that say that these are not natural alliances that have been made between the political parties with the only objective to counter the Rassemblement National. And so this might actually give them more power in the future to gain the vote, maybe as early as 2027. And there is growing frustration amongst the foreign population to be forced again and again to make this kind of vote. A second issue as well is for example, on the left side, and the fact the big success that we see of the kind of NFP, so Nouveau Front Populaire, the left alliance. Here we see, again, on the question of what people voted for, there is a number of basic elements, especially in terms of domestic issues on which these left-wing parties agree on. But we also know that there is a great deal of internal divisions within this left, especially on foreign policy issues, and that's something we'll come back to in the discussion. But for us, ECFR, looking at foreign policy, here there is a lot of uncertainty on what the program exactly is, because we have on one side LFI, which is the party of Mélenchon, which is the strongest force within the NFP, which has a line that is quite Eurosceptic, quite anti-NATO by nature, quite sceptic towards the relationship with Germany, and Ulrike is going to talk about that, the relationship with the US. They have toned down during the campaign a little bit their positions, also because of the need to do this coalition with the broader left and with especially the left of Glucksmann, who on the other side has a very pro-European, who had very strong positions on the need to defend Ukraine. And so the NFP adopted actually many of Glucksmann's foreign policy positions on Ukraine. For example, they toned down the LFI toned down a little bit their positions on NATO, but we know that there are still strong fundamental disagreements on foreign policy that may come back very soon. And maybe another, a last point on whether, what that election means exactly, whether this is a victory of Macron's bet or not. Some wonder if at the end of the day he saw something that we didn't see, and I would say that it can be seen as a victory in the sense that he really changed the narrative that we had right after the European election, where the focus was on the rise of the extreme right. Now this rise of the RN has been completely overshadowed by the success of the left-wing coalition. But as Célia said, he lost quite a lot of seats. On the contrary, the RN has gained a lot of seats. This is going to have repercussions in terms of, again, continuation of the normalization of the RN, in terms of access to new funding. Also, the campaign itself has been extremely toxic. And I think that in the long term, even if there is this relief in the short term of not seeing the RN being elected, in the long term, we have seen an explosion of racist, xenophobic, homophobic statements during the campaign that have, even further opened what was possible to say on the French public debate. We saw also some TV channels and medias, some of them close to the French billionaire Bolloré, who have really supported actively also the RN campaign. So this campaign and this whole kind of environment has really opened the window a bit further of what was possible to say and to think in terms of the extreme right. For a few weeks, the entire French population thought that we would have a RN prime minister. There were debates within the French administration and civil servants whether they would stay, whether they would serve a RN government. So there has happened, there has been a huge psychological shift happening, and I think that this is opening the window maybe actually to something that might backfire in the future.
Thanks very much, Camille. And of course, it was not just the French public that were expecting to be having to look at the prospect this morning of Rassemblement National Prime Minister, but also a lot of capitals in Europe were widely anticipating this. We were all together last week in Madrid at our annual council meeting of ECFR, where almost every conversation had an element thinking about this as a prospect and what it means for the European project. Ulrike, you were one of the few analysts over the last few weeks that actually went into some detail on not only the prospects of the RN foreign policy and European policy, but also what the left coalition might think along this front. So I wondered if you could sort of just look at the upcoming challenges at a European level over the next weeks and months, and tell us what you think this morning is maybe possible now that we didn't think last week was possible, and vice versa, what isn't, in terms of what this means for how France is going to work with other European capitals.
Right, thanks a lot, Susi, and a good morning to everybody from Paris, where I think there has been a big sigh of relief last night and again this morning. Similarly, to be honest, to the sigh of relief in European capitals. I mean, Berlin, I guess most clearly, but also others. Yeah, as Susi said, I did indeed spend quite some time reading through the kind of program of the Nouveau Front Populaire, so this left's coalition, as well as the older program of NUP, which was a very similar coalition after all, as well as La France Insoumise position on foreign and especially European policy. And this is exactly the point, La France Insoumise. For me, the big question when it comes to what will this left party coalition want to do, what can it maybe do, what will it do on foreign, on European policy, the answer to this lies in how strong will La France Insoumise and Mélenchon be. And I was quite struck by the fact that yesterday night, when the election results came in, it was Jean-Luc Mélenchon who took the stage and who gave the big speech. And you saw Raphael Glucksmann in the background with the kind of pained expression he has had, for the last week, which always shows that he's not particularly happy with the coalition as it has formed, or with the grouping. It's not a coalition, he's the German speaking, with the grouping as it has formed, but kind of had to do that. Because after all, what really came out when looking into this grouping's program is that on several foreign and security policy issues and European policy issues, La France Insoumise is taking the most extreme positions, and there are some that really can create problems within Europe. So I guess the strongest, although I don't think it's the most problematic within Europe, is on Israel policy. Obviously, the left has had a whole kind of infight on this. La France Insoumise has taken rather strong positions against the Netanyahu government, which they basically call all kinds of names. They want to end the EU-Israeli association agreement. By the way, this is the whole coalition and not just La France Insoumise. So I think on that, there might be the strongest push. But yeah, we'll basically have to see. On other things, again, I think let's take NATO, right? The relationship with NATO. Jean-Luc Mélenchon has for years and years been quite critical of NATO as a kind of US imperialist outfit, similarly actually to what Rassemblement National has been saying, and he and his party have proposed to leave NATO's integrated military command, again very much like Le Pen and Rassemblement National did. But again, they're not just the only party that has been elected here, and also they've toned down these positions a little bit given the war in Ukraine, against Ukraine, over the last 2.5 years. So a lot of question marks, but we basically now have a situation where we do have not quite a majority, but a strongest party with a coalition with parties in it where you don't quite have a majority for one party, but a strong showing for an extreme party. And so this makes all of this quite tricky. I do want to spend a second just kind of, putting on my German hat, because there are some things that I think were really quite striking when you look at what Nouveau Front Populaire really wants. When I read the Nouveau Front Populaire program, especially kind of the beginning, I was really struck by how many things seemed so familiar, because they're formulated almost in the exactly same way in the German traffic light coalition treaty. So when you see kind of feminist foreign policy, more green diplomacy, so diplomacy working towards a greener Europe, 0.7% of French bid for developing aid. All of this is verbatim in the German coalition treaty. So you could say, great, we've got a partner here. But of course, when you move on to other topics that may less be the case. But this is just to say that there is definitely an opening here to work with this left coalition. Yeah.
Thank you. And indeed, I don't know whether it was him himself, but I did notice that towards the end of even Mélenchon's comments, he was talking about notre Europe and the Europe we need. So so clearly that European perspective's there. But I'd like us, and I should say to those joining us online that the Q&A box is now open, so please feel free to throw in your questions too. But I'd like us maybe just to spend a moment on Macron. As far as I'm aware, we haven't heard anything from him yet in terms of reactions to this. But I wondered if any of you wanted to comment on sort of what this does for him, and whether sort of going forward to international meetings over the next few weeks, he is going to be able to sort of continue to pursue the sort of strong European agenda that we've seen as kind of a centerpiece of his of both of his mandates, in terms of, has he been absolved, vindicated in a sense, with regards to other European leaders? Because clearly policymakers as well as the French public felt at some stage over the last few weeks that maybe he'd taken a risk that shouldn't have been taken in terms of what this did to France and the European project. I wondered if any of you wanted to comment on that. Célia.
What's kind of ironic this morning is that nobody won, and yet all three groups are claiming victory. It looks like everybody is sort of looking at the results and saying that they've been, as you said, vindicated by the results. So not only, actually, National Rally is saying that they've done an amazing score and that they were just blocked because of tactical voting, because of the unnatural alliance of the centrist group with the far left group in order to block them. The leftist coalition, Nouveau Front Populaire, is claiming victory, and they have such a claim, but they are also saying, as Mélenchon said when he just came after the announcement of the results, saying they're going to put in place their entire program without any compromise, which is what you can say when you have an absolute majority. It's not at all what you should say when you have only a very very relative majority, and you're going to have to actually compromise. And then the Macron camp is doing actually much better than they could have expected only 2 weeks ago. And there is, I would say, a sort of a risk that Macron feels vindicated by this result, or that from the outside we perceive it as a Macron victory because he was able to avoid the worst scenario. Let's just be frank here. The Macron camp has been divided, reduced by a third after this election. Emmanuel Macron has probably lost the possibility of governing by himself, which he has enjoyed for the past 7 years. And so even though he has sort of transformed the European Parliament election dynamic into another dynamic, it's not a dynamic basically shifting the dynamic from the far right to the left. It's not yet a dynamic that is fully in his camp. So what is needed, and why I'm underlining this, is that what's needed at this stage is for all three corners, the three-way split of the French politics right now, to realize that they're going to have to learn something that is completely foreign to French politics, which is coalition building. And on that front, I think we should seek help from our German neighbors who know how to do that when we don't. Again, there's no claim for the left to say that they would be able to apply their program in its entirety without compromise. There is no claim at this point for the centrist platform to say that they will gather around themselves without, again, compromising on the program. And obviously the far right has no claim into governing, and in any case doesn't want to take part in a coalition. So the only two options that seems to be appearing is one that would be slightly more center-leaning, or one that would be slightly more left-leaning, but that will have to be some form of negotiations. It might take weeks, and the only thing I would say about Macron himself.
Just on that, Célia, sorry to interrupt, but we have a question in the chat box
sure.
asking whether it could take more than weeks. What's your sort of best guess in terms of whether we could have a Belgian or Dutch style coalition building period and kind of see it through for the whole year that is possible before the next elections?
I'm not quite sure, actually. What I think I believe is that by July 18, the National Assembly will gather and have to elect a president of the National Assembly. So you will see emerge a first sort of understanding around this assembly on who's going to at least lead the debate at the National Assembly level. And that was always considered to be a sort of a deadline for, presenting a government at that point. However, just to put into context, we have the Olympic Games coming up. If for a variety of reasons, everybody feels that it's worth negotiating for a longer time, there is a possibility, I believe, as far as I know, to just reconduct this current government for maybe the time of the Olympics or something, in order to make sure that this time is stable and it's fully functional, and that, the rest of the world and France can enjoy this wonderful event. And then, that the new assembly can slowly have, a government emerge out of it. And there might be, constitutional prerequisites that I am not sure about. But in any case, this conversation will have to happen. And just my last point on this is that as far as we know, and up until today, President Macron has not demonstrated his capacity to negotiate on his own program. Remember, he's been elected twice in front of Marine Le Pen in a second round, with quite a substantial, strong support in the first round, but never a majority support. And yet, Emmanuel Macron has always, claimed that he wanted to put in place his platform, that he was governing from his perspective, and that's what he's done so far. He has not been able, after 2022, when he lost the absolute majority at the National Assembly, to form a coalition either with the left or with the right in order to remain in a majority position. He has governed from a minority standpoint. So we have no proof that this president will be an astute political negotiator. We just have to see whether everybody rises up to the task. But there's a big question mark on how and where this negotiations will come from.
And as you said, it's not only Macron that doesn't have a great history of negotiation. Certainly, La France Insoumise, as you said, is not at the moment putting out, at least in public, the feelers for starting any kind of talk. So it's hard to see how this goes from there. But you know, we've been sort of dancing around the issue because it's so hard, but I can see that kind of at least 2/3 of the questions in the box are now about who we're expecting to see in terms of the new government. This is maybe a bit mean, Camille, but I wondered if I could sort of throw to you what the question, we sort of maybe two. One is what you see as the most likely outcome for the government at this point. You don't have to put figures on it, but what's your sense of what's most probable at this point? And maybe also the question that we have there about, is it 100% impossible that it will be Mélenchon, as he seemed to indicate himself was 100% sure last night?
So thank you, Susi, for asking the hard question to me. And I'm not going to try to really predict anything, because to say the least, this whole campaign and elections have been extremely unpredictable. And if you had told me just a few days ago that the left would have been the winner, or at least the numbers of seats of this second round, I wouldn't have trusted it. So
in fact, I did a couple of weeks ago in Paris, and you did all laugh at me. So I confirm that that's
So that's why, like, a lot can happen. As Célia said, when we look first at the responses of some of the main party leaders and voices in terms of their willingness or not to make coalitions with Macron. So Mélenchon came very openly saying that he wouldn't. We had also on the LR side, I mean, it's still unclear, but we have also some signs and voices at the moment that seem to suggest that they're not really open to a coalition. Laurent Wauquiez also said, like, he was that they would not play Macron's game once again. Glucksmann was probably, so more on the center-left side, was probably the one that had a more responsible language and narrative towards a potential coalition. He talked about the fact that we needed to act as adults and that there would be a need for dialogue. So these kind of initial reactions give a sense already of who would be willing or not to take part in that conversation with Macron. If we add up the seats, though, if we don't count the seats of the LFI, for example, and of a couple more, we don't reach a full majority at the assembly, even with a coalition. So what could be possible is to have a kind of, maybe still a coalition, but with a kind of minority government, where there would be a need to then, on project by project, negotiate, and law by law and regulation by regulation, negotiate at the assembly and try to find coalition of projects on a project by project basis. But that would mean, of course, much less power to Macron, and that would mean also a shift of the center of gravity of power in France to the assembly, after Macron being, very presidential, very, very centered around himself in his type of leadership. This is going to change quite a lot also the way how the different power relationships are happening. There had been discussions about also a potential technical government, in case no strong voice would emerge. That's a possibility as well, but I feel that this option was raised mainly at a moment when the RN was appeared as likely to win, and where we were trying to find solutions that wouldn't include the RN in the kind of coalition. Maybe this option is a bit less likely in a situation where we still have like two strong non-RN blocks of parties, but But yeah, I agree with Célia that this is going to demand a lot of internal negotiations and compromises that we're not sure Macron's party is ready to make, and this is going to weaken definitely his voice on the kind of like European international scene, his ability to take strong decisions, and on whether Mélenchon could be. Your question was whether Mélenchon would be a prime minister.
But whether it's 100% sure that he won't be, we've got that question in the box.
I mean, he doesn't want to do a coalition anyways, and I don't think. I mean, again, I don't want to make any prediction, but at this stage, I don't see how that would happen.
You don't see anything. Great. Okay, so Célia said we needed some advice from the Germans on coalition building. So Ulrike, coming straight to you now, and feel free to comment on any aspect of this discussion that you want to. But I wanted particularly to ask you, looking at this situation this morning, which do you think gives France sort of more stability over the next period? A sort of a fragile coalition of parties that sort of agree to work together because that's what the results dictate is possible, or the kind of project by project approach from minority government, I think, scenario that was one of those that Camille had put forward. You know, sort of speaking from the point of view of a Germany that has lived through a relatively uneasy coalition in recent years. What do you think would be best? What would you do?
I'll let that question sink in and let half my brain work on that, because it's an interesting one. There was one point I absolutely wanted to comment on, and that's something I've been thinking about since last night, because Camille just said, you know, Macron will have less of a strong voice on international negotiations, Europe, all of that. And of course, I mean, yes, that's true. He, you know, used to have more support in the parliament than he does now. However, I gotta say, for me, the biggest change since last night, or between last night and, say, the week before, is that this whole narrative of Macron now really being a lame duck, and really, you know, I actually, you know, said this to journalists that, you know, he will now go to international meetings and no one will ever listen to him because we know that he doesn't have the support in parliament. You know, he can say whatever he wants and no one will listen to him. I actually think that's less true than we all thought it would be. And this fact mainly stems from the fact that his party, Ensemble, came in second. They came in second and before Rassemblement National. So quite honestly, I think he can still, and he's still president, of course, but I think he can still do the kind of, you know, going to the international meetings, take reasonably strong positions. Now, of course, everybody knows that, yes, he doesn't have a majority in parliament, but they also know that the president does have quite a lot of power and that he still has support. So let's put it this way. I'm not sure that the days of Macron making big statements and telling other Europeans what to do, that they are over. In the way that, honestly, I thought they were over, you know, 24 hours ago. So that's just one point. On Germany, so I was actually thinking, you know what, it's interesting that now the French are looking towards Germany, because in a way, Germany is almost moving more towards France in its political system, and that we now increasingly have parties, almost also kind of three blocks, if you like, that don't want to work together and can't work together. So I kind of worry that we're moving more towards France when it comes to that France is moving towards us. But yeah, maybe they can learn something from the coalition governments. Okay, so fragile coalition or project by project. I'm torn. I mean, given the French political tradition, I would kind of think that maybe the parties would be more comfortable in a fragile coalition, because at least they would know, you know, where to go.
What
like,
rules
okay,
are.
yeah, exactly. So how to vote, and this is where we're going. Whereas project by project, of course, you need to find majorities every time. But I think, if I can predict, I think it's more likely we're going project by project in a way. But it's very hard to tell, and neither of those are particularly comfortable. So yeah, if they can, I can very much recommend do a proper coalition with the coalition. Everybody agrees, but I don't quite see this happening with these majorities or these election results that we had.
Interesting. Great. Okay. Célia, we've talked a little bit about NATO, but we have a question in the box asking sort of what this all means for the broader global picture in terms of France in Europe and relations with the US, China, and others. I wondered if you wanted to comment on this aspect from your work as a fellow on the transatlantic relationship, and yeah, what you take away from this from that point of view.
Well, that's another trick question. Thank you, Susi.
I'm having a great time this morning.
It's difficult to project from those very hard to read results resulting of a lot of tactical voting at the French level all the way towards the impact on Europe. One of the elements that's happened yesterday night that is a sort of a moment in change and that could shift a lot of the conversation is when Jordan Bardella, during his speech announcing, talking about their defeat at the hands of a coalition, an unnatural coalition between Macron camp and the left, as they portray it, announced that the grouping of that Marine Le Pen's national rally will join the grouping of Viktor Orban, Patriots for Europe in the European Parliament. What that signals is that there is a structuration at the European level of these groups that are getting bigger and bigger, even though, those are evolutions that takes time. It's not as massive as one would have expected. For example, yesterday's disappointing results for the national rally. Yet, if we look at a few years ago, it's already increasingly growing. And Marine Le Pen will be Marine Le Pen's party will be the biggest number of MEP from France being sent to the European Parliament and joining Viktor Orban. And by that token, they are also joining a sort of perception of their, the place of Europe in the world. We know that under the Hungarian presidency, Hungary is determined to, and Orban is determined to sort of portray Europe as diverse in its positioning, in its geopolitical positioning. So not as pro-American as one could expect, not as pro-NATO as one could expect, pushing for a ceasefire, as they say, between Russia and Ukraine, pushing for a lifting of sanctions against Russia. And so these elements are not at all yet a majority in Europe, but they are slowly growing and slowly, making their voice heard. They used to be extremely marginal, but with this new grouping, I think they're taking a bigger hold in European politics. And this could then continue to shift even further if we see in the US President Trump making a comeback in the White House, and suddenly you have stronger nationalistic voices in Europe and then a strong nationalist voice in the US, and all of them agreeing that potentially NATO is not that important, Ukraine is not that important, and that they are all in for themselves. On China, I'm not sure we can take a bigger, when we look at the programs of the different coalition, left, right, center, far right, nobody talks about China. They all, one of the elements is that Macron has pushed for this idea of a strategic industrial policy, reindustrializing Europe, a sovereign Europe, the idea that Europeans should defend themselves and invest in their own industrial capacity in a moment of higher US-China competition. I don't see any of those, left or far-right groups being against this type of position. It's something that is being negotiated and talked upon at the Brussels levels. And what the left coalition will be concentrated on is purchasing power, is putting money in the pockets of poorer France, in taxing the rich by and large, and in putting together a new ambitious climate plan at the French level. That is going to be their priority. Then if you look at the far right, they're going to continue talking about immigration, and they also are on the same typical similar lines on purchasing power by and large, and focusing on energy in particular. And so on industry and on fighting back against the competition between the US and China, you have as close as it gets to a national consensus, actually. There's no fundamental opposition that I can see from left and right, unless I'm mistaken.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Camille, in your opening comments, you talked about anger among the sort of the French middle ground, if you like, at having been pushed again to vote in barrage against the Rassemblement National. And indeed, there were, I think, in a few of the speeches that we heard overnight from Attal, from Glucksmann and others, that there was a recognition about the effort that was made by so many French voters in voting sort of unnaturally, if you like, for a party that they didn't actually identify with. In our question and answer box, we've got a question about whether we're likely to see the sort of humility in the discussions over the next few days, particularly from Ensemble, but also I think from the left coalition, because there were people voting left who wouldn't have chosen to as well. That will be the sort of the ingredients of moving France forward. So I guess this is a sort of a slightly broader question than the coalition that comes out, but about the sort of the damage that has been done by this process to the sort of political society in France. What's your sense on that in terms of where we are today?
Well, humility is not usually a word that defines very well the French culture and even less the coalition in power. But I would say probably no, unfortunately, for the reasons that I and Célia mentioned, which is that what we hear is the three big groups of parties are trying to actually portray and frame this election as a victory from their side. The Ensemble group, so like the Macron's grouping, portrays that as, this shows, the French voters have voted against the RN. This shows that we were right from the beginning in terms of the positioning of trying to make a coalition of all the Republican parties to counter the RN. So they try to frame this as a victory and as a kind of like, we were right from the beginning that this is the only way to counter the RN. It's from the left side, it's also portrayed as a victory. From the RN side, not really portrayed as a victory, but really it feels in the post-election narratives that they're really using a lot that narrative of the stolen election that I think can be very dangerous in the long term for a democratic system, because there is a part of the population that voted for RN that was really waiting to see these results, and the polls were actually going in that direction the past few weeks. And that feel that their vote has been stolen, and they're going to use, I think, this type of narrative a lot in the coming weeks and months. As you said as well, I mean, Macron is also criticized outside of his party, but also a lot inside his party. And his Prime Minister Gabriel Attal, in his speech right after the results of the election, were quite strong and quite. He clearly marked the fact that he didn't choose this solution and that this was imposed by Macron. So he really marked his kind of position differently from Macron. Same from a few other voices. I'm thinking as well about Edouard Philippe, who also took a very distinctive position from Macron. So within his own camp, also Macron has appeared a bit, isolated. Just adding a point also on the way this campaign has reshuffled a little bit some of the political dynamics in a way that could become, and again, I'm going to be the pessimist one in the room a lot, but that reshuffles the power dynamics potentially in favor of RN for the future. We have this reinforcement of the tripartite division that can be, again, potentially problematic for a future vote. There is also a weakening of the, let's say, the Republican right, LR, although they have survived the vote better than what was expected a week ago. But the fact that we had this division during the campaign between a group that decided with Ciotti to join the RN and the other, this has weakened also the kind of more Republican rights. You had the reinforcing of RN with the weakening of Reconquête, which was the extreme right party with Marion Maréchal rejoining RN. So like you had a number of reshuffling within some of these parties' dynamics that continue to kind of reinforce RN, and I think in the long run, or at least this is how I read it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Ulrike, you've often been heard to say that on both the far left and far right of French politics, there is a German problem in terms of thinking about the Franco-German relationship. We have, as you and others, I think, have said, in terms of the sort of the broad messages from this election, a sort of a commitment to the overall idea of France's security in Europe. But at the same time, we have a question in our box about whether the strong votes that we've seen on both the far left and the far right pose problems for the kind of the specifics that underpin that in terms of cooperation between France and Germany on defence projects. I wondered if you wanted to sort of pick this up about whether that there's a problem with the sort of the tools to underpin the vision on Macron's security project.
Yeah, so France and Germany have several more, but especially two major defense industrial projects at the moment that they're doing together. FCAS or SCAF, the airplane plus, they're doing together with Spain, and then MGCS, the combat tank, they're doing together. Both of these projects are huge and hugely expensive, and they've had issues for many years. No one is happy with them. Let's be very clear. All that being said, and as much as I try not to make predictions, so not to be proven wrong, I do expect these projects now to limp on, so to speak, with this new Assemblée Nationale, simply because RN was very clear in that they really wanted to kill them. Like, they hated them. It was extremely clear in their program. For them, this was really one of those things that France just shouldn't do, and it wasn't good for their sovereignty. And so I think for them, it may have been possible that they really saw this as kind of symbols and wanted to kill it quite publicly. I don't quite see this with the Nouveau Front Populaire and even within LFI. They may not necessarily like those projects. They may find things wrong with it, but I would be very surprised if they choose this to kind of aim their target at and say, we're going to end this, because it would create huge Franco-German problems. It would open all kinds of questions about actual military capabilities. And so on this, I'm going to predict, I think they're going to limp on. Honestly, they already have all kinds of problems to begin with. You don't need political issues, so we'll see how they develop. I'm not saying this is necessarily an aircraft that will fly and a tank that will roll, but I would be very surprised if that was just, the priority they took, killing these projects. Why?
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much indeed. I wondered if any one of the three of you wanted to come in on a final question in our box about Russia. So the attempt earlier this year from Macron to create strategic ambiguity about how far France would go vis-a-vis Russia obviously became quite a sort of a toxic issue in terms of the French political landscape. What is your sense in terms of where this election leads us? Can we expect sort of, is this an area where we could expect sort of broad continuity again from the government coming in, or do you see any big changes? Who wants to take that? Célia.
Maybe just a word on that to say that this election by and large was not about foreign policy. This was very much an election, a referendum on the national rally, but also a referendum on Emmanuel Macron. So an expression of you know, the fear of the far right, but also the disagreements with the current governing majority, and a lot of it focused on domestic issues and a lot of the criticism coming from the difficulties of the working class and middle class in France. So the fact that foreign policy did not appear as much doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Indeed, Emmanuel Macron is associated with a pro-European platform, and more recently pro-Ukraine platform that he battled. He also stepped up the language with the language on whether or not at some point Europeans should send troops on the ground in Ukraine, which as demonstrated by the ECFR public opinion studies that just came out. We have a new report that came out on July 4th that you can consult that shows that in France as well, you know, the support for Ukraine is steady. The support for the idea that this will end necessarily negotiations, but that Europe should continue to support Ukraine before eventually this would lead to negotiation. This is across the board. The difference is that in France, we've seen numbers change a bit from January, with French people more worried that France is at war with Russia, with French people more worried that you know, that Europe should continue to push Ukraine to fight, and this may have been because, you know, the French president raised the stakes and sort of frightened the French public in some way. It both mobilized the French public, but it also frightened the French public. And so even though, you know, foreign policy was not the heart of the matter, there is a heightened sense of uncertainty for France. What world are we living in? Who are our true friends? I think still a very strong support for Europe across the board in France, but also high uncertainty of how France and Europe should defend themselves in an increasingly competitive world. So I don't think we can make a lot of prediction. As Ulrike said earlier, this election is actually probably the best news we could have imagined, the results, the best news we could have imagined for France staying the course, because even if it's going to be divided, even if it's going to be weakened, I agree with Camille on this, it's not fundamentally different. We are not waking up today in a fundamentally different France where, you know, President Macron would be completely sidelined and where, you know, the pro-European voice would be over. That's not the case. It's just we could expect France to be a little bit more focused on its domestic turmoils. But by and large, I think there's no reason to fundamentally shift gear. And apart from the steady rise of nationalistic populist parties across Europe, I don't think there's a specific French story this morning, but maybe I'm mistaken.
Great. Well, I think that's a helpful sort of note for us to finish on. But maybe just in the last minute, it would be good to get your sense, and perhaps I'll leave the floor with you, Célia. Is, you know, France's electoral system often gets a lot of respect internationally in terms of its ability to with the two rounds to hold back extremes. Looking at the situation this morning, has this election sort of in a sense reinforced that view from within France, or do you see that differently?
Absolutely. The the two-round system has absolutely functioned, but there's a limit to the two-round system. It also creates high frustration. I just wanted to put, you know, to show something that demonstrate that there's something to be said about this election not being fully representative of maybe what French people wanted. This time around, when we look at percentages in the second round, the National Rally got 37% of the vote. The new Popular Front, the Nouveau Front Populaire, the left, got 26% of the vote. And yet they are far ahead. And the Ensemble got 22% of the vote. And they're also ahead of National Rally. The reason being is not about the percentages. This is not a proportional representation. You have to win every single of these elections. And so maybe you arrive every time very high. Maybe you arrive at 45% of the vote, but you are if your two opponents are aligning between themselves, they win. But why is it important? Because this 37% of the vote is almost as much as the 38% of the vote that Ensemble, that the Macron got in 2022, and he got to govern. So one of the risks of this system is that it works to prevent the far right from getting into power. It does work, it still works. One of the issues is that it creates frustration for the 40% of the population that has decided otherwise. And we have to be, you know, clear about that. And that's why, once again, I think none of the other camp have a strong mandate to say that they should govern. They should all learn to compromise, and they should all learn to work with each other. Hopefully they can hear that this morning.
Well, yeah, we'll continue to talk about that. Camille, I'll just give you your two fingers on this, but we need to wrap this up now.
And if I can just add to what Célia said, like, I don't know if we can make really a parallel because things are different, but just as a reminder, Giorgia Meloni got elected after one of these, you know, technical government of aligning all the parties against Fratelli d'Italia, and this actually created the possibility of her election later. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as well, and see that this is a possibility for France as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, look, thank you all. I think that was a great way for us all to try and make a bit of sense of the picture at the beginning of the week to hear your hot takeaways. And I'm sure we'll be continuing the conversation through webinars, in writing, and more broadly from ECFR as the picture evolves. But thank you all for joining us, and have a good day.